Okay, let me check. Okay, let me check. Right. Okay, welcome everyone. This is the first in our philosophy talk series at our newborn philosophy department at Marmara University. And today I am happy to announce you our presenter, Dr. Sotiris Mitralexis. Dr. Mitralexis is currently a visiting research fellow at the University of Winchester in the Department of Theology, Religion, and Philosophy. He's held various other positions before, such as a teaching fellow at the University of Athens. He has been Seeger Fellow at Princeton University, visiting fellow at the University of Erfurt, visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge, visiting senior research associate at Peterhouse, Cambridge, and assistant professor of philosophy at Istanbul Şehir University, where I had the pleasure of working with him. So very nice to see you today.
Thank you very much, Professor Hatipoğlu. Thank you very much also to Marmara University for the invitation. And I'm overjoyed to hear that a series of talks will commence.
Exactly.
And I'm particularly honored to be the one commencing them. So
yes.
Thrice thank you.
Yes. Actually, yes, we're going to have a total of 4 talks this term. Let me just mention that here. And I will try to continue saying a few more words about you. I will try to keep it short, but given the accomplishments, it's going to be a little difficult to do that. Dr. Mitralexis holds not just 1, not just 2, but 3 doctorate degrees. He holds a doctorate in philosophy from the Freie University in Berlin, a doctorate in theology from the Aristotle University in Thessaloniki, a doctorate in political science and international relations from the University of Peloponnese. I hope I'm saying these correctly. He has taught philosophy in Athens, Berlin, and Istanbul, University of Winchester, perhaps too. I'm not exactly sure of that, but
there is a research position primarily.
Yes, yes. He has various publications, which include books, edited volumes, and journal articles. So I'm just going to mention a few of the names of his books. One of them is Ever Moving Repose, a contemporary reading of Maximus the Confessor's Theory of Time, published in 2018. Another one on the methodology and theory of the history of philosophy, published in 2017. Another one, Church-State Relations, in 2019. And his most recent monograph, Subversive Orthodoxies, is, I believe, forthcoming with Winchester University Press, if
Inshallah.
Not already published.
Inshallah, it's forthcoming. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sinem.
Yeah.
By the way, the talk today stems from a project, a 3-year project, After Science and Religion was its title, under Professor Peter Harrison and an array of researchers. And one of its outputs is a book that was actually published today in Greek, an edited volume in Greek. So After Science and Religion. So today's intervention, today's presentation is related to that project as well. Yet my task in this is not to address the science-religion debate per se, but the public aspect of it. So I am approaching that from the perspective, if you'd like, of popular philosophy, as it were, rather than a systematic treatment, etc. Seeing it under a more aligned beyond any of those 2 disciplines, science, religion, if science is a discipline, which it is not. So The debate usually concerns itself with science and religion. However, what about the popular representations, the ideas associated with them that are presented as self-evident givens? Here I will explore certain prevalent misconceptions as they frequently emerge in the public sphere, certain popular urban legends, as it were, by first examining the premises behind them. Now, it must be said that why should one do that in the context of the science and religion debate? Well, first, in order to discern the difference of the popular idea of those two entities, and the difference between that and actual science and actual religion beyond ideological or historical even misconceptions, etc., and to know what is the case in the whole spectrum of the issue. And in the last 2 decades primarily, yet even in the first book that hit this was even in the 70s, there is a big discussion concerning how religion as a category, encapsulating all religions, being an abstract concept that is substantiated in particular religions, etc., is a very modern invention, and that it's not really a very useful category. So my presentation will take that into account. So implicit in any current discussion on science and religion are usually 3 core premises. A, that there is a social or a general phenomenon called religion, within which all different religions are to be contemplated. B, that natural science is to be perceived as a wide area of inquiry that is mercilessly objective and utterly devoid of unproven axioms. That is, devoid of anything resembling knowledge by revelation, which is usually ostensibly reserved for religion. C, that the natural state of affairs entails the illegitimate claim of religion to answer some of the questions situated within science's domain, with the best case scenario entailing religion's self-restraint and thus peaceful coexistence. For example, the new atheism movement, Richard Dawkins, etc., it's very strong on this idea that religion illegitimately responded to questions normally belonging to science, and this must stop. This was the idea. So the thought behind these discussions is the very fact that science and religion are rather modern inventions, at least in the way we understand them today, which, however, is the only way we understand them today, apart from very obscure specialists in libraries or laboratories. Peter Harrison, formerly Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford University, now back in Australia at Queensland, has masterfully demonstrated in his The Territories of Science and Religion, a book I cannot recommend enough, Chicago University Press 2015, if I recall correctly. Thus, he demonstrates in The Territories of Science and Religion how our modern and contemporary understanding of science and religion that is usually thought of as primordial bodies of knowledge explaining the world, is surprisingly modern, a 300 years affair at most. To a certain extent, the very roots of that modern understanding lie in the Reformation itself, but this is a different story. And the peak, of course, is in the 19th century. In the 19th century, these take a definitive shape. To my mind, scholars familiar with the study of the human past cannot but agree with this conclusion after reading Harrison's book. However, in spite of this, and this would be startling news to many, if we are to judge by how, in almost the totality of the religion and science debate, these two notions are violently projected to the past as reified substances. One will often hear that there was always a battle between science and religion, for instance. The real problem, however, lies in the fact that those two modern notions, in stark contrast to the realities they strive to point at, which obviously precede the modern notions, the real problem is that the notions are by definition antithetical and mutually exclusive, not the things, the names, when examined closely. In the modern conceptualization of science and religion, 2 competing narratives for the explanation of the world around us are offered, according to the narrative it is, one evidence-driven and one mythology-driven. That's what we read in newspapers, popular magazines, etc. Given that the religious narrative is seen as frozen in time, as it were, While science is further developing every day with newer evidence and proof, these cannot but clash and collide. By the way, the very notion that religion has a dogma that is ossified in time and space, etc., for example, in the Christian tradition I was raised in, does not reflect historical reality. We took 7 centuries to arrive at what is today thought of as the Eastern Christian doctrine. And the Roman Catholic Church is still developing its doctrine. So the idea is not that at some point in time a truth emerged and this is ossified and not to be revised or developed in any way. The problem is that by accepting to enter into the sphere of meanings offered by the modern notions of science and religion, one has already inescapably accepted the only logical conclusion that this can lead to. By accepting to employ this language, one by definition accepts the conclusions that are inherent in this language. Thus, we have to revisit the language. According to the narrative inherent in the very concepts, these two explanatory systems might be that competing at an age when science was not mature or powerful enough to challenge religion and was being trumped by it. But perhaps a new age has dawned and so forth and so forth. That's again the narrative to cite, but one example, Ian Barbour's schema of 4 possible science-religion relations, conflict, independence, dialogue, or integration, testifies to this, as it asserts the mutually exclusive nature of science and religion, with the latter 2 options, dialogue and integration, signaling attempts at accommodating this mutual exclusivity. Even in the case of the friendlier options, the setting is still one of taming the lion, for example, in the case of dialogue, the lion being religion, or of subjugating it in the case of integration. One would expect that insights such as those by Peter Harrison on the subject, demonstrating the problem with the very terms used and the fact that, in a sense, the game is rigged, would have acted as a game changer, changing the debate itself by inescapably changing its frame. However, it is not difficult to see that this is not the case in the public square, at the very least, in the public sphere, in the popular dialogue. Applauded as they are by scholarship, insights such as these have not resulted in a change of this magnitude. They have set off debates that run parallel to the religion and science one, such as the one we are realizing here, while the not always scholarly arena of the religion and science debate goes on with its peaceful life of mutual character assassinations and vigorous argument recycling. And what is vigorous here is the recycling, not the argument. Why is this the case? I believe that this is because our cultural context effectively precludes any capacity to conceptualize science and religion differently on any level other than the purely scholarly one. Science and religion are not just 2 concepts. In their modern and current reincarnation, they are foundational concepts for the constitution of our globalized Western worldview, the given worldview in which we all exist to some extent, to this or other extent, in which other worldviews are integrated via commodification, effectively annihilating them. Starting with modernity, the popular semantic contents of science and religion form a sizable part of the very fabric of our shared worldview, of our cultural presuppositions, most explicitly articulated in the Enlightenment juxtaposition of a grand age of science or rationality to a grand age of religion superstition, a dark age. By the way, elements of that are to be witnessed also during the pandemic, a public debate that has much to do with science and religion, religious congregations that should stop, etc., etc. So it's quite timely. Trapped within this narrative as we are as a culture, secularism seems to be the only conceivable future since the world, according to the narrative, progresses. This renders the current global resurgence of religion, with the United Kingdom leading the few exceptions in the world, utterly incomprehensible. How can it be that the natural route would be the annihilation of religion, and now we see the resurgence of world religion since the early 90s, particularly today, and confines the discussion on post-secularism within the walls of academia? That is, what are we now to analyze, since the game has obviously changed according to the prophecies of sociology back in the 60s. These are now obsolete, as it seems. Peter Berger, for example, who was the one who had the secularization thesis in the 60s, that as society progresses, religion will disappear, forced to reconsider in 1989 with his book, I think, The Resurgence of Religion is somewhere in the title, Post-Secularism and the Resurgence of Religion, something like that. So the very prophet of the secularization thesis himself had to say, sorry, reality negates our former position. So the struggle, according to the narrative, of a liberating science with an obscurantist religion is one of the most important and prevalent foundational myths of modernity, culminating in our current predicament. Even entertaining the possibility of approaching reality with different notional tools seems unimaginable, as it presupposes being able to think outside the box of our culture writ large. And it is to be debated whether this is possible at all at a scale larger than that of academia and its ivory tower. So, I believe in science, as they say, is the title of the next section. If the public conceptualization of science, religion, and the debate on the two is indeed a building block of the way we are as a culture, that we are to acquire access to reality and assess it, then a change in this conceptualization would require nothing less than the advent of a next cultural Weltanschauung. But cultural Weltanschauungen do not change on order or as a result of texts and discussions. The emergence of texts and discussions signaling previously inconceivable ideas might reflect the gradual advent of a new cultural Weltanschauung, but the opposite is not the case. It's not the texts that bring it about. The intelligentsia does not and cannot cause changes of that magnitude. It is rather these cultural changes that engender their respective debates, even in the very early stages of that transition. However, even the developments within the science and religion debate, within the discussion delineated by the modern understanding of these terms, and not necessarily questioning them, causes a certain awkwardness to the observer. One would think that in the presence of certain rather unassailable arguments that have been contributed on particular aspects of the debate, at least those aspects would be considered settled today. But alas, this is not the case. For example, and as far as Christianity is concerned, Conor Cunningham has fascinatingly demonstrated in his book, Darwin's Pious Idea, that a Christian protesting against the theory of evolution anybody believing that evolution refutes, for example, Christianity, has either not understood evolution, nor Christianity, nor both. And as a matter of fact, this is not only a scholarly position. The Roman Catholic Church, the biggest church there is, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Anglican Church, and many other churches have in many different ways declared the compatibility of their witness with evolutionary theory. Yet the debate on evolution between science and religion rages on, taking the extremist minority positions of certain US evangelical groups and the God of the gaps as the mainstream of Christian faith, which it is not. On a more popular level, the paroxysmal publicity of the new atheism movement has prompted a number of remarkable responses, including, for example, Alistair McGrath, who, apart from the polemical Dawkins delusion, has offered a number of monographs on the science and religion debate, which one would expect to affect the eclipse of the recycling of a number of ever-present substandard arguments. For example, that religion by definition refutes Darwinian theory, which is not the case. But this does not take place. So, literal readings, this is also a problem of this debate, that the ones who raise the criticism usually think it as self-evident that literal readings of scriptures or important writings within religions are to be understood today, are to be read today in the way we read an encyclopedia, a Wikipedia, or the journal Nature, which is not just a modern idea, it's a silly idea that scriptures are to be read like this. The ancients, or any pre-modern person, had many, many different ways of approaching such kinds of texts, and not the one we see today. It seems that on the popular level, the debate is almost immune to intelligent conversation. For example, one assumes that any serious take on the matter should take into account the claim that a wholly literal reading of the Bible, for example, is a fairly recent phenomenon and occurrence, and in no way to be projected back to Christianity's historical presence as a whole. Sorry for having Christianity rather than, for example, Islam as the point of reference, but this is the area I have been working on, so there you have it. As David Bentley Hart argues in a recent book, for example, and I quote, "The ancient and medieval church had always acknowledged that the Bible ought to be read allegorically in many instances, according to the spiritual doctrines of the church, and that the principal truths of Scripture are not confined to its literal level, which often reflects only the minds of its human authors. Origen, Basil of Alexandria, Gregory of Nyssa, Augustine, all denied that, for example, the creation story in Genesis was an actual historical record of how the world was made. Augustine did write what he called a literal interpretation of Genesis, but it was not literal in any sense of a modern fundamentalist would recognize. And figures as distant from one another in time as Augustine and Aquinas cautioned against exposing Scripture to ridicule by mistaking the Bible for a scientific treatise." End of quote. Again, the very idea that we are to read ancient texts in the way that we today learn to read a general nature is in its very core a silly idea. However, this does not bar important and impactful professionals and intellectuals from adopting this idea, which is a bit disturbing. Rather than that, it is always, almost always taken as a given that Christianity is an obstacle to scientific progress because it supports a literal understanding of its scripture. One could go as far as to claim that within that tradition, Christianity, mercilessly literal readings of the Bible challenging natural science is a phenomenon to be encountered only within modernity and particularly late modernity, particularly if one includes post-Reformation developments as early modern ones, as one ought to do. As instances where religion gladly assumes the role modernity has prepared for it, in contrast and departure from its very tradition, from its very historical truth, as it were. Another foundational myth of modernity concerns the age of darkness prior to the Enlightenment, with us now treading the secular path of light. This is of importance for our inquiry, as the historical myths on science and religion play a crucial role in the current public debate. But the debate goes on, virtually uninterrupted by powerful arguments. And this, I contend, is because that particular debate is one of the default functions of our societies due to the cultural and historical context we find ourselves in. And now, in the previous comments, there was also a remark on how either truly, as in the case of fundamentalist American evangelicals, or erroneously, it is projected upon religion that it tries to play the role of science. However, I will also focus on the rest of my presentation on how science acquires in the public sphere, not within the laboratory, a quasi-religious nature. This, however, has hardly anything to do with the reality signified with the word science and religion today. Granted, these notions are modern, but they still strive to signify certain realities. Which would these be, examining the terms in their current usage and insofar as the debate at hand is concerned? Science as a whole per se, that is the sum of the fields of natural sciences, including the formal sciences as well, mathematics, for example, and their practical application, cannot by definition, science itself, participate in such a debate. It is not science that participates, persons participate in the debate. Science does what it does. It describes natural reality in an ever more accurate way, often making earlier yet not less scientific models obsolete. An earlier scientific model was scientific. If science progresses and we see that a newer model is better and more correct, the previous one is obsolete, but this does not make it less scientific, obviously. And sometimes it facilitates the practical application of this knowledge. Thus, the debate is on science. It's not a debate by science. It is not, of course, science itself that enters in such debate. So we refer to a dialogue of science and religion, but there are important implications in understanding that this is never a dialogue between these two realities, that is, between the sums of persons or institutions representing them, but rather a public dialogue with a political side as well, implicitly or explicitly, on science and religion. At the precise moment a scientist will go into the lengths of using the conclusion of any scientific field in a metaphysical manner, in a manner containing meaning, etc., or against a religion, or in favor of a religion for that matter. At that precise moment, at the precise moment, the conclusions of science will be employed to respond to questions of a wholly different kind and nature than purely scientific ones. We find ourselves outside the walls of science proper, and within scientism, which in the public sphere often becomes the cult of scientism. This is not to say that scientific findings cannot inspire, for example, philosophy, or that we are not to do philosophy of science. This is an utterly different kind of entity. I'm speaking about how when a scientist as such pronounces conclusions that go beyond the findings themselves, he does not act in the precise scientific role as such anymore. This is not necessarily to be negatively evaluated, but we have to take note of that distinction in the context of this discussion. We witness, however, how often it is the case that people are eager to effect a communicatio idiomatum, a communication of properties between science and religion. Thus, scientific conclusions are employed to construct what is in essence a religion as it is understood in modernity. That is, a set of individual convictions, providing answers to questions of meaning, sense, and purpose, to metaphysical questions, to ontological as well questions. That is, to anything but scientific questions proper. I find it truly fascinating that this perversion of science and its morphing into a religion on the public sphere, this religion of scientism, is to be seen very clearly in the texts themselves, and not simply to be encountered as a vague caveat of the form when science attempts to respond to metaphysical questions, it ceases to be science. Allow me to borrow an example from Alistair McGrath's book, which portrays how the very same scientific conclusions, data, easily morph into metaphysical convictions while still raising the claim of being simply science, pure science, mere and descriptive scientific discourse. So, let's consider a statement made by Richard Dawkins in his first and particularly scientific book, The Selfish Gene. This is not a Dawkins book like the late ones, on the public, participating in the public debate, etc. This is a scientific book on genes. And I quote Dawkins: "Genes swarm in huge colonies, safe inside gigantic lumbering robots, sealed off from the outside world, communicating with it by tortuous indirect routes, manipulating it by remote control. They are in you and me. They created us, both body and mind, and their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence." End of quote. Please remember this quote because there will be a juxtaposition afterwards. We see here, McGrath remarks, a powerful and influential interpretation of a basic scientific concept. But are these strongly interpretative statements themselves actually scientific? To appreciate the issue, consider the following rewriting of this paragraph by the celebrated Oxford physiologist and system biologist Dennis Noble. What is proven empirical fact is retained, is the same in both the Dawkins quote and the Noble quote. What is interpretative has been changed, this time offering a somewhat different reading of things. So Noble rewrites the empirical data from Dawkins's quote. Genes are trapped in huge colonies, locked inside highly intelligent beings, molded by the outside world, communicating with it by complex processes through which, blindly as if by magic, function emergence. They are in you and me. We are the system that allows their code to be read, and their preservation is totally dependent on the joy that we experience in reproducing ourselves. We are the ultimate rationale for their existence. So you see that the mere scientific facts are retained, but everything else has been changed, and it's not recognizable as the same thing anymore. So, in quite the same way, a scientist who is also a Christian might employ the conclusions of science to theorize on the validity of his or her metaphysical convictions, a number of scientists take the liberty to interpret findings in a way that turns said findings into metaphysical teachings, teachings on the meaning, cause, and purpose of life. The difference lies in the fact that the former is aware of the fact that he or she is referring to religion, while the latter thinks that their metaphysical convictions are simply science. So, thus the science and religion debate becomes the very arena where science turns into a religion, purporting to provide answers to questions that have not much to do with the methods and goals of science, for example, with what happens in the laboratory or in the distant stars, or inside the atom at the subatomic level. Propositions such as the universe is utterly random and devoid of meaning, the only meaning in life consists in the gene's reproductions, and the like, are pure religion, and quite facile religion at that, one might add. Agents from both science and religion, if we are to judge, for example, by the American intelligent design controversy on school education, where religion becomes science, seems to be immune to the realization that science and religion, even in their current, modern, recent conceptualization, respond to wholly different sets of questions. The fact that we are culturally conditioned to think otherwise and to construct meaning on the science-religion wars seems to entail that the logical coherence is, from a certain point onwards, out of the question in the public sphere or in parts and corners thereof. Now we come to religion and the question whether there is such a thing as religion. While in the current conceptualization of science, there is indeed such a thing as a science writ large, that is the sum of the fields within natural sciences, perhaps including formal sciences, and the scientists working on those fields, the same cannot be accurately said of religion. However, I must add to the previous statement that there is such a thing as science writ large, all the sciences, but the scientific method in the singular seems to be more of a heated debate whether this is the case. For example, there is not one and the same scientific method in basic biology and quantum mechanics. In no way. Very vague statements could be said to the effect that there is the scientific method which applies to both, etc. So on religion, it seems from, as far as recent scholarship is concerned, particularly in how notions change, intellectual history and history of ideas, that there is no such a thing as religion in the singular and the abstract. And while this may seem counterintuitive, it is indeed surprising how the subject eludes a minimal definition that actually works, that actually applies to all religious groups, but not to extra-religious realities. What would be this definition, which would include all religions, but not non-religious activities? Granted, the claim will be made that religion, in its modern and current conceptualization, entails a set of asserted convictions, which may or may not be based on a holy book, which may or may not be accompanied by ritual practices, which may or may not entail moral imperatives, may or may not be organized in one or more groups with discernible and normative hierarchies, and so on. Any religious group with pre-modern roots and at least minimal self-confidence would strongly protest against a reductive definition thereof, seeing it as a sum of certain convictions and certain practices, and would face grave difficulties in recognizing itself in such a definition. What is meant in the current discourse by religion, that is an abstract phenomenon of religion, encompassing all particular religions, is precisely what communities, such as, for example, the Christian Church, is not. Granted, it is easier to identify religions in the plural, what we would today call religious communities. However, a summation of all possible religious communities in one abstract, capital R religion would be disastrous, in contrary to science, where this can be done. In spite of our given reflexes, this hypothetical sum of religion would not possess the internal characteristics and the coherence necessary to construct a viable term. To illustrate this by example, the notion that Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, ancient Greek paganism, Islam, Australian Aboriginal religious traditions, Pentecostalism, Mormonism, and New Age religious movements can be validly and intelligently described as part of the abstract phenomenon of religion having common characteristics is hardly a tenable notion, particularly when one needs to incorporate in this the myriad other religious communities. The same cannot be said of categories such as science, politics, or art even. To give you a very slight example, one would say religion is to believe in one or more gods. Does this apply to Buddhism? Thus, it is true that believing that religion exists as a valid category is a superstition, an irrational and unfounded conviction. And I'm here referring not to religions, but to believing that there is such a thing as the abstract category of religion, apart from and beyond the actual communities addressed, the real communities that are there, that can be meaningfully used in sentences in a way that is not both directed by and obscured by the mythologies of our epoch. What is important to note here, once more, is that the way in which the debate is set predetermines its sole possible outcome. Religion in the abstract predetermines the invalidity of any particular religion, however defined. Because if the category is valid, it cannot be true that one of all those component religions holds truth or something. Speaking about religion in the abstract requires at least the guise of the external, unbiased observer, the bird's eye view, or God's view, as they say, by the way, in a synonym. One that by definition cannot assert the truth claims of one religion over the truth claims of another religion. The sole basis on which religion in the abstract can be truly conceptualized, that is truly with full semantic coherence, not merely for the convenience of a discussion, is one in which the possibility of a very real chasm between one true religion and other false religions would be inconceivable. And note that I'm here accepting to play along with the definition of any given religion as primarily a set of conviction held by the individual as true, which is a modern understanding of religion itself, a set of convictions, things I believe as true or not. This was not the case in the 7th century, was not the case in the 4th century, was not the case in the 11th century. Thus, to discuss about religion is to become an atheist. Agnosticism will not suffice. In order for a valid and tenable neutral ground to be established, on which one may conceptualize religion in the abstract or all religions, it is not enough to adopt a stance in which any given religion, in the current sense of the term, may or may not be true, yet an agnostic stance on the matter may be assumed until further notice. The establishment of such a neutral terrain presupposes the programmatic eradication of the very possibility that religions, or one of them, might possess precisely what we think that they usually claim to possess, according to the current definition. That is, nothing less than capital T truth. And precisely therein lies the fundamental illiberalism that pluralism entails. And this, of course, is by no means an argument for intolerance or for a lack of pluralism, but part of a critical, philosophical, if you'd like, inquiry on the nexus of interrelated issues and the problems with certain notions we think of as written in stone. Pluralism not merely tolerates, but accepts all religions and doctrines, but only insofar as they are false. Pluralism annihilates truth in the most literal etymological sense of the word annihilation. It requires that the very possibility of truth in them is turned into nihil, zero, a gap that is then immediately filled in by the truth of scientism, in stark contrast to actual science itself, which is doing its job and doing it very well, and thank you for that. Thus, pluralism imposes a doctrine on the meaning of things, a doctrine in which the possibility of truth itself equals zero and is substituted by the doctrine of scientism. And you can bring your own truth into this circle of peaceful coexistence, provided that you accept in advance that this truth is essentially false, a lie. Violently bundling disparate phenomena under the big tent term of religion and then defining it as convictions plus paraphernalia is but one of the fundamental problems, such as the ones described above. It is to be noted, however, that this is not a vocabulary inquiry devised for the purists of language. Without the notion of religion in the abstract, the very idea of a dialogue and debate between science and religion collapses. The question, for example, of the relationship between science and Islam, or science and the Eastern Orthodox Church as particular communities, is a valid question of a substantially different kind to the question of the dialogue and debate between science and religion per se, in total, not merely one of its purported constitutive parts. You can do a science and Islam debate. You can do a science and Roman Catholicism debate. You cannot do a science and religion debate. And if it is not atheism that is presupposed here, atheism being again a set of convictions borne by the individual, a metaphysical stance, then at the very least, secularity forms the most basic and inescapable presupposition, which in turn forms a gap that is immediately filled by scientism, a religion. Again, by entering the debate, one has already accepted its spurious premises. And now for something completely different. Three international bestsellers are the books by Yuval Noah Harari, Sapiens, A History of Humanity, Homo Deus, with a subtitle to the effect of A History of the Future, something like that, and 21st Lessons for the 21st Century, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. Harari is incredibly popular. It is surprising to see how many people who read his books, etc., and they read it as a mantra, as reading the wisdom of a very wise man. Now I'd like to take Harari as a case study of scientism, as the norm of science rather than the exception. As a secular techno-religion, I will focus on the book Homo Deus, Man, God, A History of Tomorrow, or something like that. Since we're here preoccupied with misconceptions in the public sphere, it would be only fitting to provide a short comment on Yuval Noah Harari, an Israeli history professor, an immensely influential writer and public intellectual. His books Sapiens, Homo Deus, and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century have become global bestsellers and have been embraced by an impressive variety of media outlets, thus further contributing to the influence of his thought on millions of minds. For example, when the Prime Minister of Greece tried to show that he is a world champion on battling the coronavirus and the pandemic, which, by the way, lamentably he's not, he invited, I assume not pro bono, Yuval Noah Harari to discuss, the politician and the philosopher discuss how splendid is the politician by extension, to see with how much power Yuval Noah Harari has. A prime minister will invite the professor for a discussion so that the media image of the prime minister is elevated. This is power. This is not just books and ideas. Harari's wide-ranging erudition, bold synthesis and style are potent explanations for his impressive success. However, as often happens with considerably popular public intellectual, Harari's thought both reflects or gives shape to pre-existing ideas and concepts in society and engenders them. So there's a certain recycling, if you'd like. There's a reciprocal relation between originality and creative repetition that often makes certain ideas resonate. Truly novel ideas cannot resonate so easily because they are alien, they are strange. Thus, a case study of Harari's thought also provides us with valuable insights on potent discourses in the public sphere and popular misconceptions, given the author's success and impact. In the book I will be focusing here, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, there's the title, in which Harari attempts a sketch of the future on the basis of current, mainly scientific and technological developments. The author often takes a critical stance on the developments he is presenting as self-evident givens. In doing so it's like a critical support, if you'd like, for those developments. In doing so, while a certain expected development might not necessarily be presented as positive, or its ramifications may be analyzed as potentially ominous, the expected development itself is not put into question. We have to assume that it is a given, this will happen, end of story. That is, an internal critique is attempted in Harari's book, which leaves the basic premises shine as purportedly self-evident. Apart from expected developments, spurious analyses of the past are also presented with the flair of self-evident givens, and are most probably consumed as such by a majority of readers, particularly to the extent that they resonate with their pre-existing conceptions. For example, writing on the difference between science and religion, Harari comments that, and I quote, "The most important segments of many religious dogmas and are not their ethical principles, but rather factual statements, such as God exists, the soul is punished for its sins in the afterlife, the Bible was written by a deity rather than by humans, and the Pope is never wrong. These are all factual claims," says Harari. Many of the most heated religious debates and many of the conflicts between science and religion involve such factual claims rather than ethical judgments. This is a paragraph that has been disseminated widely and has immense impact, and people take it as a given. Harari knows what he's writing about. The problem with these assertions by Harari is that every single one is questionable at best. No religious dogma asserts that the Pope is never wrong. And even in Roman Catholicism and the case of ex cathedra pronouncements, these have at best taken place merely once in 1950 and at worst 7 times in history, and only are on particular doctrinal issues. So the idea that the Pope is never wrong is not to be found within Roman Catholicism. No apostolic and non-Reformation church, again, with the exception of American fundamentalists, would proclaim that the Bible was written by a deity rather than by humans. This is not asserted of the Christian Bible in any way, nor of the Hebrew one. One may find theologians ready to subscribe to the simplistic statement that the soul is punished for its sins in the afterlife, but at best, such a simplistic assertion is extremely bad Christian theology. And even the assertion God exists in the same sense that my bicycle exists or this PC exists would raise the eyebrow of any non-ontotheological theologian, as well as important figures of the past, fathers of the church such as Maximus the Confessor, who would comment that, and I quote the 7th century thinker here, "Non-being is properly meant with regard to God, since he is not one among the beings," for example. This is due to the created-uncreated distinction, and it's called apophatic theology, but for what it's worth, that's what the patristic author writes. This is just an indicative example of problematic, if not radically distorted premises. Misconceptions about religion often seem to set the tone of the dialogue on science and religion, as has been demonstrated above. To sum up, the dominant tendency in the public sphere, one could say that religion theology is primarily presented as a caricature of simplistic, baseless convictions, with the very idea of affording a closer look at its witness being at best woefully outdated, at worst nonsensical. An example from Harari, quote, "Holy scriptures work the same way. The religious establishment proclaims that the holy book contains the answer to all our questions. It simultaneously forces courts, governments, and businesses to behave according to what the holy book says," end of quote. On the contrary, there's something clearly sacred in science in those writings. Even if it has not answered all questions already, it will soon do so, and its pronouncements are always ex cathedra. The fact that a unitary science, rather than a plethora of often incommensurable sciences, does not properly exist and rather lies embedded in the fabric of modernity's mythologies, has to elude the attention of the public sphere's discussions on this, so that the above credo, the above doctrine, can work. In popular scientism, science and technology in particular usurp what they understand as the promises of religion. The difference being that these are now the rightful heirs, while religion is seen as the long-standing usurper from the past. Conquering death is the most obvious example. Harari writes, and I quote, "Modern science and modern culture have an entirely different take on life and death. They don't think of death as a metaphysical mystery, and they certainly don't view death as the source of life's meaning. Rather, for modern people, death is a technical problem that we can and should solve," end of quote. The fact that pronouncing death a technical problem rather than a metaphysical mystery is indeed a purely metaphysical position itself seems to elude our author. But let us proceed to the sacramentalization of science that is attempted here. Harari continues, quote, "And every technical problem has a technical solution, of course. We don't need to wait for the second coming in order to overcome death. A couple of geeks in a lab can do it, overcome death. If traditionally death was the speciality of priests and theologians, now the engineers are taking over," end of quote. As should be evident, engineers promising the end of death does not constitute the end of religion. Rather than that, it constitutes a new religion. Scientism simply offers a new religion. It is not coincidental that Harari speaks in terms of prophecies, which would make Nostradamus blush. And I quote Harari, "The breakneck development of fields such as genetic engineering, regenerative medicine, and nanotechnology fosters ever more optimistic prophecies. Some experts believe that humans will overcome death by 2200. Others say 2100. The next century or the one after the next. Experts say that we will overcome death." My concern here is not to show the inconsistencies of Harari in particular, which could be rather easy, but to present his techno-religion as an example of what discourses are dominant in the public sphere by both shaping it and being shaped by it. Popular techno-religions promise a new genesis and present humanity, soon in the guise of Homo Deus, the man God, as creating its own successor species, much like in the ending of Michel Houellebecq's Atomized. Harari writes, and I quote, "Bioengineers will take the old sapiens body and intentionally rewrite its genetic code, rewrite its brain circuits." Is it not like, apart from a new scripture, alter its biochemical balance and even grow entirely new limbs? They will thereby create new godlings who might be as different from us sapiens as we are different from Homo erectus. So we may well think of the new human agenda as constituting really of only one project with many branches, attaining divinity. This was the quote from our prophet, Harari. For techno-religions to have coherence, it is vital to deny any designations of humans as something more than conscious animals. That is, as something more than a random evolutionary development that provided the conditions for humanity's dominance on Earth. It goes without saying that the unique, dissimilar, and unrepeatable character of every human hypostasis has to be negated, thus presenting a philosophical opinion as scientific datum given ex cathedra by the life sciences. Harari writes, "According to the life sciences, 1. Organisms are algorithms, and humans are not individuals, they are individuals. That is, humans are an assemblance of many different algorithms, lacking a single inner voice or a single self. 2. The algorithms constituting a human are not free. They are shaped by genes and environmental pressures and take decisions either deterministically or randomly, but not freely. 3. It follows that an external algorithm could theoretically know me much better than I can even know myself," end of quote. Harari will speak at length on organisms and as nothing more than algorithms. Thus, together with anything that could provide a unitary character to the inner self of a human being, while consciousness cannot be outright refuted by definition, it must be downplayed or rather explained away. Naturally, the soul has to be attacked. However, it is hardly the case in serious theology and philosophy that the soul is seen as a thing, as an object, as a res that either exists or does not exist. The complexity and depth to be found in the history of ideas on the concept of the soul is indeed vertiginous. One could perhaps rather simplistically argue that the mystery we today call consciousness has been called soul in other times, mutatis mutandis. We know things about consciousness, but scientifically we do not know many crucial aspects on its nature, etc. How consciousness emerges, this is still a mystery to science. We know what happens when it emerges, or how it emerges, or what is activated when it emerges. But how consciousness emerges is still a question that has not been answered scientifically. So, today we call this agent consciousness. One could argue that the very same thing could have been called soul in earlier times. Of course, there is a question on the immortality of the soul, but apart from that, which is an aspect of the discussion, what we today term consciousness is just another word for what other people in other ages term soul. However, while consciousness cannot be refuted altogether, although it arguably presents the very same problem, using the terminology of soul must be undermined in order for the organisms, our algorithms, credo, to have coherence. Harari's argument here is rather problematic. He contends that Darwinian evolution is incompatible with any of the many terminology of souls, as this would entail that the offspring of a soulless organism would indeed have a soul, which is presented as a reductio ad absurdum, a reduction to the absurd. And again, I quote Harari, I hope it's the last quote, because I can't stand him. So, Harari, in contrast, Darwin has deprived us of our souls. If you really understand the theory of evolution, you understand that there is no soul. By the way, all these sentences are like a hypnotist sentences to the reader. Only if you really understand, then you jump to the conclusion. Experts say that, etc. I continue. That's why the theory of evolution cannot accept the idea of the souls, at least if by soul we mean something indivisible, immutable, and potentially eternal. You might argue that human souls did not evolve, but appeared one bright day in the fullness of their glory. But when exactly was that bright day, Harari writes? When we look closely at the evolution of humankind, it is embarrassingly difficult to find it. Every human that ever existed came into being as a result of male sperm inseminating a female egg. Think of the first baby to possess a soul. That baby was very similar to her mother and father, except that she had a soul and they didn't. Our biological knowledge can certainly explain the birth of a baby whose cornea was a bit more curved than her parents' corneas. A slight mutation in a single gene can account for that. But biology cannot explain the birth of a baby possessing an eternal soul from parents who did not have a shred of a soul. In a single mutation, or even several mutations, enough to give an animal an essence secure against all changes, including even death. Is a single mutation able to do that? Hence, the existence of souls cannot be squared with the theory of evolution. End of quote. One of the many conceptual problems of this argument is that if there is anything peculiar in human consciousness rather than a soul, in human consciousness, then this would also appear in one bright day in the context of evolution. Of course, this would perhaps slowly evolve over time and generations, but if there is something distinctive that can be named human consciousness in particular, including, for example, the ability to theorize on the future, for example, then a red line would have to be drawn between a predecessor that would not possess it and an offspring that would indeed be the first human being with full consciousness. For example, with the ability to think of her death, to think of the future, etc. Of course, Darwinian evolution does not speak against either the existence or the emergence of consciousness. The fact that Harari's arguments against the soul is followed by an extensive analysis on, and I quote, by the stock exchange has no consciousness, end of quote, can be seen as a witness of what could be described as a selective demand for coherence. It is peculiar then that a popular book with so simplistic aphorisms may also provide one of the most succinct descriptions of our current predicament. It is a quote I fully agree with. And the quote by Harari is, "Modernity is a deal. All of us sign up to this deal on the day we are born, and it regulates our lives until the day we die. Very few of us can even rescind or transcend the deal. The entire deal, the entire contract can be summarized in a single phrase. Humans agree to give up meaning in exchange for power." End of quote. Now may I ask, I only have a page more, so 3 minutes. I will be just needing 3 minutes more. Problems addressed in the debate now. Much of what has been said in this talk concerning the public debate on religion concerns the public debate on religion and science. However, what about certain practical and wholly tangible aspects of the debate, such as the stem cell controversy? Another example would be transhumanism, albeit a quite hypothetical one at the moment, although during the pandemic that discussion has accelerated. Don't we find there an example of religion allegedly striving to inhibit the march of science due to religion's convictions, a march that could improve or even save lives, and so on and so on? It's a serious question. I think that even in such most practical of aspects, thinking that this can be discussed in terms of religions in the abstract can be misleading. Areas of inquiry such as this set the stage for the most foundational of moral questions. What constitutes a human person? What constitutes life? What is and what isn't a murder? The emergence of divergent responses to such questions reflects a critical mass of those responses within our societies. It's not a discussion in which the only agent that has something to say is this or that religion. These are fundamental moral questions of humanity in toto. Such responses may or may not be prompted by what we superficially call religious convictions. One does not necessarily need to be religious in order to have second thoughts about aspects of stem cell research or transhumanism. What we encounter are core moral questions about which society, which includes the scientists themselves, argues, coming from a variety of starting points. Thus, the alleged enemy of science here is not the scarecrow of religion, but rather society itself, because it could raise a disagreement. Actual human beings objecting to changes addressing the very core of what it is to be human in this or the other debate and in varying degrees. And it is only by reframing this discussion that its proper dimensions may be disclosed. Trying to isolate religion as something separate from society in this context, as if the eradication of that particular element would solve the equation in the direction wished for by scientisms, as these moral questions are not scientific questions per se, irrespective of the insights science's conclusions might offer. This seems to me to require a conceptual leap of faith or faithlessness. The notion that society is a moral tabula rasa, possessing no framework that could prohibit certain experiments, and that the claim to such prohibitions only comes from an external agent called religion, rather than from the very persons constituting a society, is absurd. One might call the values of a society religion, in the conviction that were one to extract this religion from society, then any set of values, not only this, would be dismantled, leaving a nihilist tabula rasa at place, which would have no moral objections. Yes, this is simply not how reality works. In short, these are mightily important subjects, which, however, do not have much to do with the actual science and religion debate, etc. So there are indicators in all of this that something is gradually changing in a painfully slow manner, and with the phase difference that marks intellectual discussions and societal changes. However, diagnostics should not be mistaken with the cause of such gradual change, but rather be considered as but one of its first and premature effects. Thank you very much for your attention. It has been a difficult hour, I assume, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sotiris. It's been great to listen to this and get a fresh perspective on this topic, indeed. So I guess if there are any questions that are written in the chat box, we can proceed to those. But I would also suggest maybe you want to rest your voice for a bit, for a few minutes.
Rest, you said. Well, rest is always welcome. If we are to collect questions, yes, of course. By the way, perhaps there's a reason why there are more questions, because the YouTube live has a certain phase difference, so we are still discussing that.
Yes, yes.
Do you have any comments that we could discuss, perhaps? I would be very much looking forward to those. Your thoughts on all this,
sure.
Particularly as a philosopher of science and one with a scientific background.
I am, yes, I do. I had studied science, and philosophy of science is not particularly my strength. However, it's interesting to me that I don't know what you would say on this. On one hand, religion and science, the purpose, of course, is common in the sense that it's an attempt to understand. The types of things that we try to understand perhaps may differ in subfields. However, when it comes to the interpretation of the attempt to understand the world that we live in, to understand ourselves, something you said caught my attention. It was a quotation, I think, that humans would give up on true meaning the minute they are offered power.
That modernity is a deal in which we exchange the pursuit of meaning for the pursuit of power. Yes, precisely.
And I think that resonates a lot, because most of, perhaps a lot of the conflict arising from the debate between religion and science actually seems to arise from the seek of power of individuals. And thereby they seem to be the ones that give up on the pursuit of meaning and replace it with power, and put these two fields in opposite corners, it seems.
Yes, of course. For example, while much of the purported clash of science and religion is in many cases in Dawkins' mind, there are actualities in which it is the case. For example, in America, in the US, there is a clash on Darwinian evolutionary theory versus religious intelligent design in schools. This is obviously first and foremost a question of power. Will have the power to impose practically shaping the future of society. So it is 100% a struggle of power. And actually, if one looks at the demographics, and Pew Research Institute has many surveys which offer very interesting data on that, you can see the other affinities of each group, political and otherwise. And you can see the larger context in which this is indeed a quest for power and a struggling of two different Americas, and so on and so on, to such an extent that this obviously religion science question, what will be practically taught as truth, as that which we know in schools concerning how we came about, etc. But if you take the larger context into account, the science and religion element seem to be the minority element there, with all the other elements of that clash being the truly important ones, although implicit. Allow me to add a short comment on that, we try to understand, you said. This, however, also goes with precisely the modern understanding of religion as something which says things, you know, etc. While if one looks into how pre-modern realities worked, including Christianity, Islam, and other religious communities, the emphasis is on communities, not on convictions. What's particularly modern, for example, is that to be religious is to accept certain convictions, etc. This is utterly modern. It would be untraceable in the 11th century, etc. So well, there is much, or there is plentiful historical evidence to show that. For example, a very recent book on medieval history is Christianization and Commonwealth in early medieval times, something like that, which focuses on a particular ritual, Rogation Tide, by Nathan Ristuccia, Oxford University Press. It focuses on a particular annual celebration, Rogation Tide, with etc., etc. And the author takes into account new material from the last 2 decades, from the history of ideas, anthropology, religious studies, etc., which show the problematic nature of projecting religion to the past, and shows that in that era, being of one or the other religion was much more a question of which rite or community you would participate. Either once, you can be baptized, for example, or you can witness the Muslim faith. But there, it wasn't such a large statement, proclaiming, etc., always. At 1 year, you could be from another religion, but, for example, participate in Rogation Tide. And over, you would become a Christian, for example. But you would become that by being incorporated in a community and its rights, not by accepting certain ideas. The idea that adhering to a religion has to do with accepting certain ideas and that religion is an ideological mechanism is an utterly modern phenomenon. In order to conclude with that and go to the questions also of the audience, I think there are some questions.
Some questions are floating.
Let me give some literature on that, if I may. Please. First, Peter Harrison's The Territories of Science and Religion. This is an impeccable book. I cannot recommend this enough. Now, on the problematic nature, Chicago University Press, 2014-15, on the problematic nature of the concept of religion today as an anachronism, there's the book Imagine No Religion, How Modern Abstractions Hide Ancient Realities by Barton and Boyarin, Fordham University Press, 2016. Before Religion, A History of a Modern Concept by Brent Nongbri, sorry, this is Norwegian, Nongbri, Yale University Press, 2013, Before Religion, A History of a Modern Concept. Now, we hear about how religion incites wars and violence. William Canavo has published in 2009 from Oxford, The Myth of Religious Violence, which again takes a closer look on how religion as a modern category of ideas, etc., is a very modern thing. For the more historically inclined, Christianization and Commonwealth in Early Medieval Europe, A Ritual Interpretation by Nathan Ristuccia, and Christians and Their Many Identities in Late Antiquity, North Africa, by Eric Rebillard, Ithaca and London, Cornell University Press, etc. And the very first book that hinted at that was published in 1964 by Wilfred Cantwell Smith, The Meaning and End of Religion, a New Approach to the Religious Traditions of Mankind, etc. That was the bibliographical part, if somebody is thus inclined to look deeper into that.
Thank you so much for the references. Of course, I mean, it's very important that you brought that up. It's almost by convention that what we understand from religion and this, assertion of convictions, etc. It's like it's been like that forever. That's the assumption, but it's clearly not. Yeah.
These ideas have been particularly ossified in 19th century Britain. That's where the problem lies. That's the root of the problem. 19th century Britain. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, I will just go over the. Okay, Erdal also asks. Erdal asks. Okay. In the background, I don't know if you are also capable of seeing the.
Yes, I am actually.
But I will just speak it out because
yes,
for those who are watching this, So in the background of some modern conceptions or misconceptions of science and religion and their relation, is there any effect of medieval Christian philosophy in which the issues of philosophy of nature, Philosophia Naturalis, were valued according to religious doctrine?
Thank you very much, Erdal. That's a fascinating question. Well, first of all, history of ideas. Ideas do not pop up out of anywhere. There is a certain development. So the modern conception, well, as the title implies, is modern. That is, its very first roots were to be found in the Reformation and the Protestant idea that, you know, truth is in the book. We don't need the institution. Truth is in the book. And it is there and then that the idea of the book being truth with a capital T was first to be found within Christianity. And then a number of other developments, etc. But what are the roots? So there is a positive answer to that, to your question, but let's look at the wider concept for starters. What was the meaning of these two notions before the contemporary one? Religio, religion, and scientia, science. Today, they are bodies of knowledge, competing or whatever. Back then, however, they were both different kinds, if you believe that, of the territories of science and religion, for more details, of moral virtues. They were both moral virtues of acting, in the case of religio, of being pious, etc., and of knowing, in the case of scientia, but not of knowing in the contemporary understanding of, you know, science, etc. The sciences and science, as conceptualized today, again, these are modern. What did we have before? In antiquity, we had natural philosophy and natural history. The predecessors of physics and other sciences is natural philosophy. And the predecessor of biology is natural history. However, natural philosophy was first and foremost philosophy, you know. Then philosophy was Christian in medieval Christianity, etc. And it was the only thing out there as far as worldviews are concerned within the areas of Western Christianity, where Western Christianity was dominant, etc. Eastern Christianity, areas such as Istanbul, by the way, had a very different history, but it's not of the present moment. So there was a disjunction of Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity historically, not a religious one. So the development of those notions in the Grecophone world took a different turn. But now we are speaking about the predecessor of today's Western modernity, that is medieval Western reality. So Western Christianity. So it's not that natural philosophy there, for example, would be religious because it would have Western Christianity as the starting point. The only thing out there, philosophically as well, was Western Christianity in the times of Augustine, in the times of Aquinas, for example, and then the high medieval ages, then late scholasticism, etc. So this cannot be conceptualized in the way of religion entering something that is external to here. Because natural philosophy, we could say that natural philosophy was by definition, not due to the exertion of a religious force, internal to the legendarium, the universe that was Western Christianity. Because back then, religion was not one aspect of society as it is today. We say today we have economy, we have politics, we have religion, we have our private lives, whatever, as distinct, separated, fractured elements. Back then, you cannot properly discuss politics and religion, for example, in the 12th century, in Western Europe in the 12th century, as two realities that are distinct and simply interrelate or come in contact the one with the other. It is a much more holistic reality. This fragmentation of reality into particular boxes, as it were, is something that takes shape in modernity. So in conclusion, my answer to you is yes and no. Half and half, as it were. Because philosophy, sorry, just to conclude, because philosophy of nature was the only science there was, either way. And it's interesting to know how modern, early modern, etc., thinkers and scientists, etc., give shape to this development that arrives at our current, conceptual tools. How natural philosophy slowly but gradually transforms into something else, what they say. This is a historical outlook that is of extreme value for this debate. Sorry for going on for long. I'm I finished now.
That's perfectly fine. Okay, so I see a lot of thank yous. Let me then also kind of bring up another question, kind of a general one, I guess. You mentioned again, I mean, the scientific, of course, scientific theories progress, right? So a proposition suggested by a scientific theory at one point may turn out to be false. But you said that doesn't make it any less scientific, which was a good way of putting it. So from that perspective, that's, would you agree that that's not the kind of idea one has with religious truths? I mean, if we look at the difference between the nature of a scientific truth and a religious truth, especially from the perspective that, you know, scientific theories change, the certain propositions may turn out to be false, and yet they remain to be scientific in some aspects. We don't have the same kind of, would you agree? We don't have the same kind of case for religious truth. I don't know if we can even talk about a religious progress, so to speak, maybe. Any ideas on that?
First of all, precisely because we cannot speak of religion in the abstract, we have to ask on which religions are we referring to. Now I'm a bit shy here because certain things may be different in Islam. For example, if, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a Muslim theologian, I think that Islam indeed asserts that the Quran has been narrated, has been given by God, verbatim, word for word. So this is a major difference from mainstream historical Christianity, not modern extremist Protestant evangelicals, but mainstream historical apostolic Christianity. But in order to comment on what I know better, the Christian aspect, first of all, it is full of development in many different ways. The most radical developments are unwanted ones. What do you mean by that? Christianity is understood today by most Christians under its modern guise. Christians understand Christianity as holding to a set of convictions as true, as having a positive truth value, and engaging in certain practices, rituals, whatever. So we see how that the religious communities develop not only by themselves and by their own will, but due to the very change, I will not say progress, change, development of society as such. For example, this idea now that a Christian would read the Bible or the New Testament in the same way one would read Wikipedia. It is there where I'll find correct information. I will read Genesis to see how the world was created. This is not only new, this is a radical departure from what was earlier the case. So we see development, but there's also internal development. And there I say there is only development in the sense of what remains fixed and there. First of all, we usually say, and it is actually also a terminology used within religions and theologies as well, truth by revelation. But what indeed would be truth by revelation? What does the Christian believe? The Christian believes the testimony of the disciples and apostles of Jesus. It is not that at some point, that's what they believe, the testimony on the person of Jesus. Jesus did not write something. It is not that they believe this particular religious community, this or that Christianity, that at some point the heaven, a staircase from heaven fell down, etc., and we were informed of actual reality by revelation. People may say that, but if you look closely, this is not how they think. The so-called doctrine. In Eastern Christianity, we had 15 councils up until the 8th century, where various very core, particularly central elements of Christianity were discussed about. And they were decided not by revelation, but by dialogue. There was, for example, a council on whether Christ has two natures and one hypostasis, or one composite nature, or other doctrinal issues, etc. So by definition, even the core beliefs, they are not in a book, but they develop over time, etc. And these beliefs in themselves form a very tiny minority of what, for example, an average Christian today believes, accepts as possibly true, etc. So it's only the sine qua non, practically the minimum common denominator that is decided in that. So it is full of development, not only in doctrines, which by definition develop, because we saw them developing historically, and again, in the theoretically, there could be a next council on a new doctrinal issue. So they could develop further. So they're both in the Eastern and the Western Church. But it is full of development, practically.
Thank you. I think we have another question.
Sorry, and the faithful that do not understand this, do not understand their own tradition. Sorry, but if you want my humble opinion, they should be corrected. Because there is also a question, people think that there is a static, unchanging, with no footnotes, with no rethinking it, etc., truth that fell from heaven in Christianity without any, which does not reflect the very historical experience of that religious community.
Okay, Karim Hoja has a question, which again I will read. What do you think of understanding the category of religion in terms of Wittgenstein's notion of family resemblance, rather than in terms of there being a future common to all particular religions?
Yes, which would be the overlapping similarities? Which would be the overlapping similarities between religions that would make a case for a family resemblance in a Wittgensteinian sense sound? Which would encompass all religions, but not things outside religion? Which would these be? Let's take this as an open question and try to find this out, etc. First of all, for those not particularly familiar with Wittgenstein in the audience, I shouldn't expect that everybody knows his Wittgenstein perfectly. Let me just describe it out of whatever. I'll Google Wikipedia, family resemblance Wittgenstein. Yes, Familiennächtlichkeit. according to Wittgenstein, it argues that things which could be thought to be connected by one essential common feature may be in fact connected by a series of overlapping similarities, where no one feature is common to all of the things, etc., etc. Yes, so, well, a slightly simplistic argument, but it works for a slightly simplistic Wikipedia definition. That's why, please, students, do not use Wikipedia for the students that watch us now. But it does a trick. So not all elements must be the case for all entities, etc., but many elements are. But which would this be? If you want my private opinion, I still believe that there is not enough elements that are not necessarily common to all that could make a powerful argument for speaking of religion as something which includes all religions but nothing else. Let me give you an example. Football team, Galatasaray, I don't know, etc. Its believers, first of all, they accept the hierarchy. Somebody is the head of that team. They accept the hierarchy and celebrate it in many cases. They have rituals. They assemble together and have a very strong sense of community. The rituals are regular and structured. There are truths that are not to be refuted. Our team is the best, of course. There is no argument. There is no argument for that, etc. And in certain cases, there is even an oral code. There are orders, like there are monastic orders. There are the hooligans. These are the equivalent of the monastic orders, the more radical, the radicals of the team. Okay, so this very much looks like a religion. And actually, in Greece, we have a team which describes itself as religion. Πάω θρησκεία, θύρα 13. Πάω Παναθηναϊκός θρησκεία, religion, gate 13, etc. So there are certain problems here. We'll speak of, then one would take abstract notions, piety, for example. Can't we find piety in whatever? Is there not an element of piety in the will to hold the constitution as quasi-sacred? For example. Or there is immense piety in the religionized, of course, version of scientism. The scientists told that, etc. Or science will save us from death in the next 100 years. Prophecy, whatever. Speaking of the hereafter, speaking of life after death. Well, if somebody truly speaks of life after death, then it is new atheism style scientism. There is none. But this is a doctrine of life after death.
Yes.
So I would be hard-pressed to find, even in the family resemblance context, something that would really work without us simply trying too hard, you know, to salvage the notion, to salvage the category, etc. It's important to note that this is not simply an argument that, it's an argument that takes into account new literature that has emerged in the last 20 years. I mean, we have now the ability, the capacity to see certain things in non-anachronistic eyes that we did not have previously. Because now we have the literature that tries hard to show us a way of looking at the limits of our Weltanschauung, from trying to construct something that is impossible to construct, a cultural bird's eye view, a way of seeing things beyond the self-evident givens of our own factory settings, ideological ones, I mean, etc.
Yes. Okay. All right. There are more thank yous that I see. Actually, let me just touch upon this issue of consciousness, because towards the end, you started talking about that as a property that emerges, but as if it's a property that emerges all of a sudden. I mean, like you mentioned a baby with a soul with parents who don't have souls. Of course, I mean, if we focus on consciousness per se and the emergence of it, it doesn't have to be taken as a property that comes full-fledged, all at once type of property. And instead, it could come in such small degrees that it no longer even makes sense to say, the baby had consciousness, but the parents didn't, right? That distinction is so actually cloudy, at least right now, according to our understanding, our limited understanding of consciousness. This is a possibility that it's impossible to make that distinction. The offspring has it and the parents doesn't.
Yes, I see what you mean, and I hear you. Yet certain very distinctive things, if you'd like, elements. It's very difficult to draw the line between which offspring had the ability but did not actualize it, and which actually did do so. For example, of course, it's cloudy it's muddy to try to ask what was the first human being that had the ability to think of the future, an ability that my cat, Krupskaya, does not possess, etc. Or an ability, other distinctively human abilities, to theorize about death, to contemplate one's coming death. Evidence points to the fact that my feline overlord, my cat feline overlord does not possess this ability.
Yes. Definitely.
So obviously, scientifically, it would be a silly question to ask which particular human offspring genetically, if you'd like, had an ability that its predecessors did not have, which entailed the ability to contemplate on the future. Precisely because contemplating the future, contemplating one's death, is not a gene.
Yeah.
It's a category of the consciousness, an ability of the facultas of the consciousness. It's not a gene. So there is no red line. However, the whole argument was in order to show the facile argument of Harari. Because Harari would be willing to accept all possible nuances in the discussion on consciousness, because consciousness ostensibly is a notion compatible with religion, but by definition, a notion of such rich history, philosophy-wise as well, as the soul, is to be dismissed with the ease. Okay, if there is Darwinian evolution, then some human person would have soul for the first time, whereas the previous one would not. This would be whatever, Adam and Eve. So this is not possible. So end of story, it's a silly idea. Sorry, it's not the idea that is silly. Silliness lies in the eyes of the beholder, in the case of Harari, etc. So I wouldn't go that far with this argument. It's just to show that there's a problem here with thinking in the way that Harari thinks. Yeah. And my problem is not Harari. Was he to be here, we would share chai. The thing is that you see which ideas have immense impact and power to shape mind, to shape how people see the world, to shape imagination today. And this is why we are discussing this.
Yes. Okay, another question I see. Esra asks, what do you think will make the science-religion debate ineffective and meaningless in this century? For example, any disciplines such as biology or social consensus, or is it maybe the inevitable, irresistible, and overwhelming strong of technology, or for example, religions themselves? So what do you think will make the science-religion debate ineffective and meaningless in this century?
The question that I would like to have a follow-up on is, now we mean these public misconceptions or the dialogue itself, as it were? The problem with the dialogue is that there is no religion agent to do the dialogue. There is science, but there's only religious communities which have representatives, etc. That dialogue could make sense, as I try to stress in the talk. But that distinction aside, what do you think will make the... I assume that Esra is asking, when will these misconceptions arrive at a dead end? Am I understanding correctly? How do you think one could end at a stage where these misconceptions arrive at their own dead end? For example, any disease... Sorry.
I'm sorry. Perhaps as we wait for Esra Hoca to clarify on that, maybe. Yes, she says, okay.
Okay. So I think that this has to be connected with wider historical realities. Why? Because now we are referring to what we usually call the Western world, however defined, because this is a very elusive category in itself. There was a time that the Western world was only Western Europe, and now some people thought in the 90s that everywhere is the Western world because the end of history, etc. So what I tried to argue for in the paper was that, between other things, was that the way we now think of science and religion, which makes the game rigged, forces the public discussion to arrive at the conclusions it has arrived, as it were, today, in spite of the fact that there are so many evidence that this is not the case. For example, the oversimplifications of Dawkins, etc., or the religious sensitivity of how religiously problematic, from a theological point of view, is the attempt of certain people to turn religion into science, etc. But the core elements are inherent in this world, as it were, in the post-Enlightenment modern Western world. So the debate changing will have to do with the fact that a change of historical proportions is in front of very eyes. That is the fact that for the first time in at least 200 years, the first economy in the world by far in a few years will be a non-Anglophone, non-Western, non-liberal, non-two-party system state, China. This is the first time that something like this will happen for, at the very least, 2 centuries. One could argue for long more, etc. So things will change. New cultures will have new voices, let's wait and see what they will say. China, in this case, does not bring with it a particular veneration for what we, from our perspective, call religion, etc., in order to have a very particular input on that debate. But perhaps the debate will change because, for example, from a Chinese perspective, I assume, oversimplifying and generalizing, that the question is irrelevant. I don't assume that it's a very heated debate in Chinese provinces right now, for a number of reasons. So the heat of the debate right now will be relativized because the culture that has this debate with prearranged conclusions at its core will not be setting the tone exclusively, will not be the only agent setting the tone in the public debate. So that is one element. Another element is that we witness the resurgence of religion either way. We could discuss whether this is good or bad, positive or negative, but it is a factum. It is a reality that we witness, and it seems not to be a reality that can be changed very soon, that can be reversed. We see the resurgence of religion, a new claim of religions to not to enter politics as religion, but for their faithful to have a claim in the public sphere that is related to their identities as members of a religious community, etc., etc. We see that highly secularized societies have a demographic problem. Demographic, of course, you can be proselytized into atheism or secularism, etc. But usually, societies have a certain continuity throughout generations. And highly secularized societies have a demographic problem, etc. So there are many elements that are external to the debate that will, I think, in a horizon of a century, have an effect on that debate, which again is a debate that is rigged and of prearranged conclusions, so it cannot change. However many elements you will bring to the discussion, the debate will not change. What, however, may change as well is the religious reverence for a deified science. Perhaps the pandemic can affect part of that in curious ways. Let me give you an example. We have seen countless articles during the last year, particularly Anglophone articles, on how science has triumphed. It has triumphed over superstition, over conspiracy theory, etc., etc., etc. This is the official line, however. There are other realities as well. For example, in my native Greece, from the start of the crisis, the motto, the leitmotif was, we will do what the scientists say. This is a medical problem. This is a problem primarily of a medical nature. Here we will not play as if the issue is not serious enough. We will do what the scientists do. Apart from everybody agreed, including me. Okay, this is a very serious situation. Let's things got real. Let me put it thusly. So let's see how we will be salvaged from that. However, in the long run, certain questions are being raised. What kind of politics or political philosophy, as it were, is that, where we accept that a medical discipline will dictate immediately, directly, political actions and activities that are way beyond health-related ones? Yes, of course, it's for a health-related reason that my cafeteria outside is closed, but the closure of the cafeteria in itself is not a health-related political decision, etc. And what the experts say is something that is changing so radically during the last year that Greeks are utterly confused and lambasted. For example, in the beginning, it was masks do not help, and school students will not get COVID. So no need for masks right now, etc. Then it was close the schools and wear masks. Then it was wear 2 masks, it's better. Then it was we must close the hospitality sector, cafeterias, restaurants, etc. Now they say we see that we have such peaks that it would make no difference. Open them, some experts from the official expert committee say. What do I mean by that is that this belief, this reverence of science as something that has one voice, not many voices, because, for example, there is a huge scientific discussion right now on whether lockdowns help, on this or that issue, etc., which is made via the pages of peer-reviewed journals, not in the public sphere, but in academia and science proper, etc., on the precise nature of this or that vaccine, etc. So the idea in the popular imaginary that there is one science that has one voice, science's voice, the voice of the experts, the voice of the initiates, the voice of those who know. This legendarium is being undermined right now without us noticing it. But to my eyes, it is quite clear that after such confusion during the current situation in Greece, other countries might have had a more stable line from beginning to end. But here it is utter chaos as far as what the experts say. So even if we don't notice that now, and nobody clearly thinks of that explicitly in that terminology, after the whole thing gets to an end, I think it will be more difficult rather than more easy to immediately hear somebody who says, I am an expert and I say this must happen. So this, for all the wrong reasons perhaps, for reasons that have nothing to do with science itself, will be undermined due to our experience during the COVID years in the plural, because I want to scare you.
Yes. Okay. We have one more question. I think it goes back to the topic of consciousness. By the way, it's 4 to 5. I'm hoping that this is not going to shut down immediately at 5. I'm hoping for that. So I will just read the question. And in case something happens and it automatically shuts down, thank you very much. Right now, let me say that. Also, Estraja, thanks for this well-rounded answer. I hope I'm reading the name correctly.
Michalis Sotiris.
Ah, okay.
I saw it. I cheated. I saw it on YouTube.
Okay, perfect. Should we maybe think of consciousness in terms of degree rather than a yes or no question? Should we think of consciousness as a kind of will inherent in life itself, or maybe even matter in a kind of panpsychism, and think of it in terms of degree rather than a yes or no?
Well, this is a question addressing my private opinion rather than a question on the science religion debate, the content of the paper, etc. So I'll voice my private opinion. Okay. Concerning the first one, yes, I think there is a question of degrees in consciousness. I mean, as far as the difference between what we call distinctively human in consciousness is concerned and the consciousness of my now famous cat, etc. So, well, yes, I think that, but I do not have more raw scientific data on consciousness, obviously, than the scientists themselves have. But it fascinates me that it's still a mystery. Now, concerning the second, practically matter or something else. First of all, in spite of the fact that, again, in the popular culture, it seems self-evident that there is one scientific idea that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of matter. It must be said that this is the majority opinion. And that since we do not know how the damn thing emerges, we don't know. It's an open question, so there must be two opinions by definition, because we don't have the answer right now. The majority opinion is that it is matter in the sense that it is an epiphenomenon of material reactions, etc. The other opinion is not a fringe opinion. John Eccles, Nobel Prize winner, has, for example, said that I believe that consciousness does not have a material basis itself. The question practically is the following one. Let's assume that consciousness is a TV set that plays that channel. Does your TV set generate the channel? Or is it signal coming from elsewhere? Yet you need a fully functional TV in order for the signal, for the program to be played. And if your TV has a problem, if your hardware has a problem, your TV will be played with waves, with wrong colors, whatever, will shut on and off like human beings. So the idea that the TV generates the signal, generates the program, the TV set, is the majority opinion of the majority view that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of cells, neurons, etc. Although we don't know exactly how at the moment, but we will find out soon. The other opinion is the opinion that no, it works in the way a TV set works. I'm oversimplifying here, of course, but since we have a few minutes, it's a good idea to do. But the problem is that precisely because the majority of opinion is entrenched in our popular imagination, and it seems like, you know, heretic to say something else, even data that would point to the possibility, not the certainty, that the epiphenomenon view might not be the case, is treated in a hush-hush manner. For example, there is a book by a doctor who, by the way, is an atheist or an agnostic, according to his own. This is important because we don't have a biased speaker. It's somebody who says, I'm an atheist, I do not have a theological agenda here to pursue, etc. Samparnia, who is working for a number of years in his project AWARE, which is awareness after resuscitation. Resuscitation has made huge advances during the following years. In the beginning, resuscitation was possible, whatever, some minutes, some moments or minutes after death. Now with new technologies and under particular, of course, laboratory settings, you know, to have the right machines, etc., you could have a resuscitation even after 4 or 6 hours after death. Okay.
That would be a nice trip going back and forth.
The book, but one of the books is Erasing Death by Samparnia. A lawless speaker, I am not that, and I fully oppose those practices, would tell the audience that such books may be found for free online in pirate websites. But I am a lawful citizen and I will not say that. Neither will I name such websites such as Library Genesis. I will abstain from doing that. So the book by Samparnia, Erasing Death, on the AWARE study, shows his experience in doing that systematically as a doctor who is an expert in resuscitation, not in what happens after death and consciousness. And there's a minority of patients. First of all, this is not a near-death experience. This is an after-death experience. When people are dead for 1, 2, 3 hours, bioelectrochemically in their brain, nothing happens. It is zero. Death itself, of course, is a matter of degrees as well. At some point, cells start to break down, these first, then the other ones, etc. But we can say with full medical certainty, says Parnia and the others with you, that we have full death there as far as the brain is concerned, and its ability to generate consciousness, illusions, thoughts, experiences. But there are some people with experiences, not only experiences of the type of near-death experiences. I went in a tunnel, light, etc. These are also included in the testimonies, but also as to what happened in the medical, in the hospital room itself, with details that couldn't have been obtained and are then asserted as true, like the particular tools, etc. This, of course, is no conclusive study. The thing is that there we have a testimony, a partial testimony by the medical establishment, by a doctor working in mainstream, University of Nottingham, whatever, I don't remember the precise universities right now, which emerges from something that scientifically was not possible 25 years ago, resuscitation 4 hours after death. I mean, my God. It's a Lazarus type reality that is now thankfully the case due to science. This is due to the development of science that this is now possible and lives are saved. So this could form the basis for the minority view that no, it's not an epiphenomenon, but it's like your TV set, etc., etc. But it's a huge discussion, and frankly, in a Socratic way, I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much, Sotiris. This has been most insightful. We were honored to have you as our first presenter. Hopefully the rest will go just as well. And thank you again very much.
Thank you very, very much as well. I hope that after this pandemic adventure, I will also able to come there, etc., at Marmara for a discussion or something. By the way, as I've told you back at the days of our previous university, my expertise in Maximus the Confessor, who for some time lived at Üsküdar and Kadıköy, Chryssoupolis, etc., etc. So there is also in the 7th century. So there is also this connection that makes me quite sentimental speaking to Marmara University. I wish you much success in the next philosophy talks as well, the ones to follow. And I wish you to reconvene in the only actual space, the physical space after the pandemic.
Hopefully, hopefully. Thank you very much.
Güle güle.